I'm David Risher, as these guys just said, and about 6 years ago, I founded Worldreader. It's Nico, right? So as Nico said, I've been a reader all my life. I was literally that kid who would walk down the street as I would go to elementary school reading a book, and my mother's friends would call her up and say, someone's going to kill David someday, or he's going to get himself killed because he's not paying any attention. So I kind of bring this up at the beginning, and I don't usually talk about, I'll talk a little bit about my past maybe, but it's, I think if you're running a social enterprise, the fire needs to burn, pretty deep, and it's got to, have some pretty good fuel. And for me, reading is sort of where it started. I actually studied comp lit, actually went to Princeton at University of Washington, but some Wikipedia strangeness. Anyway, I'll tell you about myself in a second. But our vision about Worldreader is that everyone can be a reader, 100%, full stop. We look at 1 billion people on this planet, and we think, why in the world are so many people being held back by lack of access to books, or low literacy levels, or illiteracy levels? And about 6 years ago, we decided to see if we could sort of address that problem. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Remind me, Larry, how much time I have tonight. Is it till 6:30?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll try to talk for maybe a half an hour and then maybe 15 minutes of questions and something like that. But so let's jump right in. And that didn't do what I expected to do. But if it works, great. If it doesn't, we've got plan B. All right, let's try that. So this is sort of a picture of the problem, right? So any big business you solve, any business you start, and ours is a social enterprise, but it's still, we think of it as a business, has got to start with a big problem. And the problem that you're looking at behind me is well, this is a picture that we took at a library in Ghana. It's a lovely building. It's a fantastic place to be, but there's obviously one thing missing. And there's a pretty clear reason why books don't make it to Africa and to parts of the world. I did a little study recently where I looked at the number of books published every year in Africa. And across the continent of Africa, about 1 billion people. Any guesses how many new titles get published every year? I'll give you, so as a point of reference, in the United States, 300,000 new books are published every year in a population of 300 million. So now let's look at Africa, 1 billion people. Any guesses at all? Pick a number. Yeah.
1,000.
How much? 1,000. Pretty close, pretty close. I mean, it's somewhere between 1 and 5,000 a year. So it's just it's a ridiculously small number. And part of that is the economics of publishing are such that it's a sort of low-value product, and of course there has to be demand for the product, right? If you don't have any demand for books, no one's going to publish books. Anyway, this is the result. About 5 years ago, I'm going to go over this super fast, and then I'll sort of slow down and go over it again. But about 5 years ago, we thought, well, hold on. Technology gets less and less expensive every single year. The need to read does not decrease. In fact, you can argue that there's never been a time in history where access to text, think of Google, think of Wikipedia, think of Facebook, think of messaging, has been greater. So you have this sort of decreasing cost. You have this increasing prevalence of technology. There are more cell phones on the planet now than there are toilets. So you have technology going up, getting more powerful and cheaper. You have the need, straight. Anyway, if we kind of combine all these things together and sort of do some different things, maybe we can solve the kind of access to books problem in part of the world. Our first idea was to use Amazon's Kindle. You're seeing here one of the earliest classrooms we worked in Ghana about 6 years ago. I'll come back to that in a second. But I will point out that even though there are books in the back of this classroom, when I walked into this classroom, as I say, about 6 years ago, and I picked up a book off the shelf, one of the first books I picked up was a book called The History of Utah. So this, to me, was another one of these wake-up calls. It's like, this is crazy. Even the books that are getting to places like Ghana, which need them terribly, aren't the right books. Meanwhile, when you put some technology in people's hands, these kids started to read. And this is a little tiny device that at the time cost $400. Now it costs $50. And it had 1,000 books on it that we had downloaded ourselves. And they would look up, and they'd finish reading the first book, and they'd say, can we read another? And we'd say, of course you can read another. So they'd go back and read some more. This is a 6th grade classroom in Ghana. And very quickly it became obvious that if we did some things right, we might be able to solve a really big problem and maybe open up a whole lot of opportunity. Again, I'm going over this quickly. I'll sort of slow down in a second. One of the other observations we had a couple years into it is, well, hold on. Kindles are great. We love them. But cell phones are even more prevalent. And so for the reasons I said before, the fact that there are more on the planet than there are toilets, and they're getting cheaper all the time. We started to work with cell phones. Again, I'll tell you that in a couple of seconds. And the last thing, just by way of introduction, that we sort of realized early on is, let's not think of this as a way to take books from the United States and put them into different parts of the world. Let's work with local publishers. Even though there are only a small number of new books published every single year, if we can work with local publishers and unlock their sort of their asset base, right, their base of books that they've been publishing for years and years, and digitize them, we can then create a pretty incredible asset. And now, 6 years later, we have about 31,000 books that we've published or published across 70 genres, 40 different languages. Okay, all of that stuff is just super big picture, just sort of by way of introduction. What I really want to talk about is, again, if you're going to start something like this, you want to make sure you're solving a real problem, and you want to make sure you've got a pretty clear vision of how you're going to do it differently from the way other people have tried before. Because otherwise, you're just sort of doing a Me Too thing, a copycat thing, and you're probably not going to get very big, which means you're probably not going to have very significant impact, which means you're probably kind of wasting your time. So what I thought we would do is spend a little time. Does anyone here know the tool called the 5 Whys? Does that ring any bells? You're nodding. Tell me what the 5 Whys is. You're kind of nodding in general. Okay, fair enough. You look like you're, yes, or I know you, yes. What are the 5 Whys?
You see a problem and ask why, and you ask why again to the answer and keep asking why 5 times.
That's it. It's sort of a simple technique, created by this guy, Deming, who's trying to understand, when you have sort of big complex systems, how do you come to the root cause of problems in those systems? And the sort of fundamental concept is, you just ask the question why over and over and over again until you get to some root cause thing. So I decided we're going to modify that just a little bit, and we're going to do something called 3 Whys and a how as a way to kind of illustrate a little bit about Worldreader. So the first question I thought we might grapple with as a group is, why reading? Why does reading matter so much? Because again, if you're going to try to solve a big social problem, you better solve one that matters. Well, there's an enormous amount of data that suggests that reading matters. It's important. I mean, you can think of it as a human right. I mean, let's just start there, right? If you can't understand what's on the printed page, you're not ever going to become your best self. You can think of it as a health issue. There's a statistic that is often quoted, which is that a child born to a mother, a literate mother, is 50% greater, has a 50% greater chance of living past age 5 than a child born to an illiterate mother. So think about that, a 50% greater chance of living past age 5 if you're illiterate. And it's not that surprising. I mean, it's very difficult to know, what the right medicine to give your child is if you can't read. It's very difficult to participate in society in a sort of bigger way if you can't read. Here's a sort of interesting little project we're doing right now in India. I'm just back from Delhi a couple weeks ago. And it sort of gets at this notion that the earlier you start to read, the better. So again, probably many of you know this, that for cognitive development, for social development, for parent-child bonding, for school readiness, the earliest you are read to, the more likely it is you will have success later in life. And so just to sort of jump forward a little bit here, one of the projects we're doing in India right now encourages parents, caregivers, to read to their children, but to read on their cell phone. And I thought I would just right up front in the talk this evening give you a little sense of kind of what that looks like to sort of give you some insight into how this program works. And we'll come back to the why in a second. Of course. And watch what happens here. Watch when the mother, Tahira, so she corrects her son a little bit, and then they start to read together. So this is a video that we took just a couple of weeks ago in Delhi. And it's one of our newer programs, again, called Mobile Reading to Children, to try to get parents to read to their kids. But again, using a tool that they already have in their pocket, that they literally already have. It's called a cell phone, and using an app that we've developed. We're trying to take this idea that reading matters and make sure that mothers everywhere around the world and that caregivers everywhere around the world know how much it matters. Here's another sort of crazy sort of statistic. There's a company in the United States that when they're deciding how big to build prisons, they look at the literacy rate in a community. The lower the literacy rate, the bigger the prison they build. So reading matters. It's a safety issue, it's a health issue, and it's also a wealth issue. And this statistic, which comes from UNESCO, suggests that if students in low-income countries left school with basic reading skills, 171 million people would be lifted out of poverty. So again, start with a real problem. Problem is low literacy, lack of access to books, illiteracy. Too many people suffer from this. They're held back from reaching their own potential. That causes problems like poverty and health issues and so forth and so on. You start with a real problem. That's number one. And the last little bit here, I'll quote this guy. He's the Prime Minister of Tanzania, and we met him a couple of years ago. And he said something I thought quite enlightened after we got a chance to talk. He said, we can afford a Worldreader e-reading program. What we cannot afford is another generation of illiterate children. So when leaders of the free world, or the semi-free world in his case, honestly, take this seriously, that suggests that there's a real need, and the need's an understood need. The second question I thought would be interesting to think a little bit about is why there? And people ask me this question all the time. Why are you starting so far away? Why not start here in the United States? Well, the business school person in me says, you want to go, if you're starting a business like this, a nonprofit or for-profit, where the need is the greatest and where the bang for the buck is the greatest. And so we decided right from the beginning we wanted to go where literacy rates were relatively low, and you can see the continent of Africa here lit up. Then we moved into India. Latin America will sort of be our third big geographic expansion. So we wanted to go where the need was particularly great, and you can measure need based on access to books or on literacy rate or whatever it is. That's sort of one dimension of this. This again was a picture from India just a couple of weeks ago. This is a slum in Delhi, and the reason we took this picture is because what it indicates is even in very poor countries of the world right now, you're still seeing a Vodafone sign. Again, you're still seeing an enormous interest in getting connected and in sort of taking advantage of technology. So we want to go where the need is great and demonstrated, but also where there's just enough infrastructure to sort of support what we're doing, because we're using technology to try to get books to people and to support them in that way rather than paper books. This is a picture, again from Delhi, a couple of blocks away from where we took that prior picture. This is a low-cost daycare center. And what is kind of fun to watch here, these are mothers picking up their children at the end of the school day there, actually around 12 noon. And what you see, of course, is a scene just like every scene in the world, of parents picking up their children. They happen to be mothers. This is what it looks like inside this kind of child care center. But what we then did outside is we asked the mothers, do you have access to a cell phone? And sure enough, about 80% of the mothers that we surveyed had access to a cell phone. Now, to be clear, it's a little complicated because sometimes the mother has access to the cell phone, but she doesn't have access to the data plan. The husband often kind of is in charge of that. And so the work we're doing in India is particularly focused on social change. How can we normalize the idea of parents reading to their kids, but also how can we make it okay for a woman who might have a cell phone to read off of her cell phone, even if it's using her husband's data plan. And so that's some social change work. But anyway, we'll figure out a way to get that done. One more little note about kind of why there. The world, and this is a trite observation, but the world is, of course, getting smaller and more connected. And diseases that start overseas tend to come, everywhere very, very quickly. This was an interesting little experiment we did about a year ago where we put some information about Ebola on cell phones into our digital library. And we found that something like, I think it was in total about 60,000. These were sort of month-over-month numbers, but then when you span it over about 6 or 7 months, we had about 60,000 unique readers read this information in Liberia and Sierra Leone on Ebola. And so it suggests that sort of even things that are sort of seen as issues that are far away, of course, ultimately are going to touch us all. And that's really the only point I'm making here. This picture, by the way, is a picture that we took of Nairobi. And I use it again to sort of to illustrate that, the picture you might have of, quote, the developing world, unquote, is probably pretty different from Nairobi. And it's fair to say that the billion people that live with low access to books or illiteracy, they're going to be the people who are our next inventors, our next doctors, our next lawyers. And so we don't think of sort of it being there. We think of it as, we're helping where their need is the greatest, and where we think our money and our resources sort of go the furthest. The third of the three whys I just wanted to discuss with us is why now? Why is this a sort of interesting problem to solve? And a lot of that really does come down to the fact that technology is getting so cheap so fast that it's sort of criminal not to kind of make use of it to solve a world problem. This product, the Kindle, which again we've been using now for about 6 years, when we started it was a $399 product, then it was a $259 product, $129. It's now a $70 product, and I just, as I was coming over here this afternoon, just got word that Amazon is in the final stages of giving us what we hope will be a $1 million grant of Kindles to use in our program, which is super, super exciting. We work with many companies, I'll come back to that in a second, for whom, if we are successful in our mission of getting millions and ultimately 1 billion people reading, it will be very, very helpful to those companies as well. And so one of the early decisions we made as we were setting Worldreader up is, although we're a nonprofit, to partner very, very closely with for-profit companies because it helps accelerate and kind of expand our impact. But back to this, as this technology gets less and less expensive and more powerful, it's sort of an incredible point in time to make use of that to solve big world problems. Bless you. This is a graph, sort of an illustrative graph of the price of a Kindle. And it won't get down to zero, but this is sort of its data points along the way. On the right-hand side, again, a picture from India. While we were in India a couple of weeks ago, this company, the Freedom Phone people, Ringing Bells they're called, advertised a 251 rupee smartphone. So that's a little over $4 smartphone. Honestly, it's not totally clear that they're not trying to scam all of India with this thing. I mean, it's not obvious that you can really make a smartphone for 250 rupees. You probably can't, but even with subsidies and stuff, I'm not sure that this is going to be the thing. But in the end, it just suggests how quickly the world is moving in this direction and how much opportunity gets unlocked if you can try to figure out a way to put that to sort of social good. By 2020, nearly 80% of adults will have a device in their pocket with the processing power that would have passed for a supercomputer not too many years ago. So this idea of the social sector, the nonprofit sector, but using Moore's law, technology gets more and more powerful and cheaper every 18 months, and putting it to use for social good, it's relatively new, but that's what we're trying to do. This is a graph that sort of shows how quickly the world is getting access to cell phones. And again, it just makes the point over and over again. In this case, it's making the point that GSM coverage, so the cell phone network coverage, is increasing faster than water access or sanitation access or what have you. So just sort of making the point over and over again. But it suggests the answer to why now, in part, is because if we don't do it now, we miss just an enormous opportunity. We don't want to get to the point where people don't understand their phone is a library and can effectively kind of be an important part of their education. That would be just a gigantic missed opportunity. By the way, people have been using technology for a long time to try to give people better access to books and try to make them into readers. This is a picture we took in Kenya, obviously. And, and this seems like a good idea at first. It seems like a smart idea. And then you realize the donkey gets tired, or, he doesn't have enough to eat, or he gets put to better use. And so little by little, projects like this would start out with such promise, turn out not to really sustain themselves. Whereas working with mobile network operators, working with technology companies who have a vested interest in seeing success, we believe that there's a higher chance of long-term sustainability that way. Just to contrast what was going on there with this picture, this is a picture of, his name is Kelvin. He is a librarian in Kenya, and we've now been working for about 4.5 years in Kenya. Kelvin, the librarian, literally goes out into the sort of field every week, and he runs reading seminars with people. And there's actually a great piece on Medium called They Call Me E-Reader. And it's the story of how he, with our support, literally goes out and people will call him, E-Reader, E-Reader. And he'll come over and do a kind of reading tent. So that's kind of the why now. The last thing, very briefly, to talk about is how do we get all this done? And then I want to stop talking and answer questions. Broadly speaking, of course, we're taking digital books, digitizing them ourselves sometimes, or sometimes they're in digital format already. If it's a U.S. publisher, we try to get them to give us those books for free. The Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, these books are not selling in much of the world, and so we say, guys, it doesn't cost you anything. Let's put them into our digital library. And then for African and Indian publishers, we actually pay them. And we think if we do this smart, we really can get to a very, very broad range of users, of readers, all the way from preschoolers all the way to students to adults. But we do it in partnership often. In fact, almost 98% of the time we do it in partnership. This chart shows that same mobile reading to children program I was just talking about in India, but it shows all of the different partners that we're working with. A healthcare center, a Marigold Network, a community outreach organization called SARD, and a publishing group called Katha. In each of these cases, each of these organizations, be it community outreach or health or publishing, again, they have an interest in seeing more people read. And so if we can work with the healthcare network, for example, that advises new mothers, pregnant mothers, on how to give birth to healthy children, making sure that those mothers know how important it is to read to their kids as they're born only helps the healthcare center, and it helps us as well. One of the amazing things that happen when you have this kind of partnership approach is you realize that you're becoming a very important part of their ecosystem just as they are helping you. This is a note that we got, our publishing team got a couple of weeks ago when we started to, we send out quarterly payments to our African publishers. And these are small businesses, right? But we literally pay them, on the order of $1 per book, which can be $5,000 or $10,000 to them in the aggregate. And this note, I think, really sort of drives home how important it is. It says, "Dear Nancy, I've been blown away by this email. I found myself opening and closing it several times to fully absorb what you've written." This is when she got her check, effectively, her payment for the quarter. "It's fantastic to see how Worldreader has gone from strength to strength. It's truly a privilege. This last amount that I received has gone towards paying for our 2 children's varsity fees. It feels very good to be able to pay these 2 large amounts at the start of the academic year." This is from the CEO of Big Bug Books. So you get a sense that this work that we're doing, which has enormous impact in communities, getting kids to read more and read better and so forth, also, of course, has a real impact on the businesses on those communities. And I thought I would just sort of briefly note some of the organizations that we've partnered with over the last years as a way of sort of suggesting that the nonprofit world is always a world of limited resources and having to make very difficult trade-offs, to the extent that we can partner with organizations much bigger than ourselves, Amazon and Microsoft, or Pearson, Penguin Random House, Bridge International Academies, or Opera Software. In each of these cases, if we can find something that, if we succeed, if we're successful, they too will succeed, that produces a very, very powerful bit of synergy, a very, very powerful kind of mutually reinforcing approach. This is a quote from the Stanford Social Innovation Review, actually, SSIR, an article called Network Nonprofit that I was very influenced by as we started Worldreader. And it says, "Most social issues dwarf even the most well-resourced, well-managed nonprofit. And so it is wrong-headed for nonprofit leaders simply to build their own organizations. Instead, they must build capacity outside their organizations." And so a lot of what we try to do is work with other organizations like small publishers and so forth to build capacity within them, and also in this case to economically support them so that they'll succeed, and as they succeed, we will succeed even more. So what have we done over the years? I mean, we started off, very small pilot project in Ghana, using Kindles, $400 product, putting a small number of books on those Kindles relatively upfront, mostly from international publishers. That was 6 years ago. 6 years later, we now have 2.5 million people reading every month on our cell phone apps. We have 100,000 people reading every month on our Kindle-based programs across schools and libraries in Africa. You saw before, we have 300 and some odd publishers, 351 publishers. We have books in 40 languages. So we've had some real impact on the world. And when you look at the reading levels of the kids in our program versus those who are not, you see dramatic differences in reading fluency scores and so forth. So we feel very excited. At the same time, we also feel very humbled by the size of the problem and recognize that getting to the millions and billions level is a very, very daunting thing, and there's no way we can possibly do it alone. The only way we feel we have a chance, in hell of making any significant impact at all is that we feel the wind at our back with technology, and technology getting cheaper and cheaper, and we feel real luck in the partnerships that we've cultivated, that they're not only helping us, but they're helping our partners. And to the extent that that mutually reinforcing cycle continues to work, we think we have a chance of having very, very large scale impact. I'll show you. I promised I was going to speak only for half an hour, and we're just about at the end of that. But we wanted to show you one last 2-minute video of one of the a Kenyan woman who we've been working with for a while, and then I'll finish up and we'll answer some questions. But listen to the story of Margaret for a second.
Around the world, over 1 billion people struggle with literacy. Hundreds of millions of them have a mobile phone.
We have the basic needs of shelter, clothing, and food. We should include even education as a basic need. Where I was brought up, I did not go to school, and there was a time I was employed in a nursery school to clean there. When I saw children learning, I had that desire in me that I can become a teacher. But I had no education, I had no knowledge. The books are very costly. They are so expensive. But now we can get information in our Worldreader books. Everything you want to learn, you can find it in the phone. And now my dream can come true. Because now I've started teaching calves. The young ones of cheetahs are called calves. Because they have phones, you can go together, point by point, step by step. Even when we are in class, they tell me, teacher, we want to know more, we want to learn more. Female cheetahs eat what cooking. I do read with my kids storybooks, folk tales. I feel very happy. They know how to read.
With tens of thousands of free books and a program promoting literacy, Worldreader has empowered 6 million readers like Margaret in just 5 years. In the next 10 years, Worldreader aims to reach 1 billion.
So that's what we're trying to do, you guys. Create a world where everyone can be a reader. We do it in partnership. We do it in technology. And we're trying to do it on a scale that is both daunting, but we think actually possible, given the tools we've got today. That's what I wanted to share with you. I think that was just exactly about 30 minutes, and leave at least 15 minutes for questions and answers. So thank you guys very much for your interest. And now enough of that stuff. Let's have some fun. What questions do you guys have? Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering, what is the cost to users, whether it's paying for your service or whether it's internet fees for data?
Yeah.
And do you have partnerships? For example, I heard about something through Facebook where they're making certain websites free to access.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Would you mind just repeating the question briefly afterwards?
Great, sure. Yeah. So the question was, what's the cost to the end user to participate in our program? And do we have any relationships with mobile network operators or other organizations to provide free access, like Facebook is doing? So the answer to the first is, so broadly speaking, we have 2 different programs. We have an e-reader-based program, which is in schools and libraries, and then we have a cell phone-based program that anyone can use. In the schools and libraries, the cost to the end user, in most cases, is nothing. But often the school will have a backer of one form or another, or will be part of a larger program where somebody is paying. So there's a third party paying for it, but not the end user. An example of that might be Pencils of Promise. Pencils of Promise is a well-regarded NGO. They operate in Ghana, among other places. They get private money, donor-funded money, to help build and run schools in collaboration with the Ghanaian government. And so they pay the fee for that, and ours is free to the end user, but someone else has to pay. There's one exception, which is a little bit of an interesting thing. Does anyone here know Bridge International Academies? Does that ring any bells with any of you? Yeah. So Bridge is a for-profit school that runs in a number of countries, including Kenya. In that case, Bridge they charge about $6 a month for a child to go to school there. And the promise is that the child will get a better education than he or she would have if going to a public school, a government school. But it's a low-cost private school. I mean, it's $6 a month that's real money, but that's affordable to many people. Anyway, this is a bit of a tangent. But in that case, they're actually charging a little bit more, about $1 more a month to be part of our program. And it's really a test. It's a test for them to see whether there's enough parental interest, and they're finding a lot of interest. And it's also a test for us to see whether there's a sort of a revenue model that we can start to apply here. That's e-readers. For cell phones, we've worked really hard to get the data costs down to almost nothing. I mean, to read a 100-page book might cost you a penny. So it's almost nothing. It's not significant. That said, we are part of that internet. It's actually called Free Basics now, but it's a program that Facebook is running to provide free access to the internet in parts of the world. It's actually quite controversial in some parts of the world, particularly India, where people are sort of seeing it as a bit of a kind of a corporate sort of takeover of the internet, and so it's a complicated world. But in any case, when people read and they don't have to pay anything, they actually do read more. So they clearly are sensitive to the cost, but cost hasn't been a big issue with reading, in part because it's so inexpensive. Unlike video and so forth, the data costs are tiny. But great question. And I mean, for any nonprofit, understanding your revenue streams, and I can talk more about this if there are other questions about it, is super important. And we have about 40% of our revenue comes from people paying, but really none of that is end users paying. It's always intermediary organizations that want to see our program in their institutions. Other questions? Yeah.
Even before you answered the question, I was going to ask, do you have a revenue generating model? Do you operate primarily in grants?
Great question. So the question is, what is our revenue model? So first, just to sort of paint the big picture for a second, our budget this year is about $15 million. So we've 15. And just again, as a sort of a quick aside, when you look at nonprofits, there's a really interesting distribution of revenue. A lot of them, and I'm excluding, by the way, nonprofits like Stanford University, which is a thing, or arts organizations. So let's set those guys aside for a second and talk about, sort of the more non-arts, non-education nonprofits. Okay. Now, a lot of them cluster around the very small, in revenue terms, maybe $100,000 to less than $1 million. Many. And then, you get sort of 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million. Then you get this kind of interesting, almost trough that happens between sort of $5 and $10 million-ish. And it's because a lot of these nonprofits, they outgrow a little bit their earliest funders, but they're not yet big enough for big government grants and sort of very, very large-scale grants. And it's a very difficult time for many nonprofits. Many nonprofits get sort of stuck in that area. It's called the social enterprise chasm. And it's a little bit frustrating, actually, because, I mean, in a sense, the numbers are all very small. In the for-profit world, these are all tiny businesses. But in the nonprofit world, there seems to be a bit of a kind of resistance point there. Anyway, back to your question. We're now, we hope, sort of on the other side of that. Of that $15 million, about 40% will come from people paying for the program, either government grants. That program that we talked about before with the mobile reading to children program, that is fully funded by Pearson. So that makes up about 40%. And then 60% is major gifts, so people writing us checks. And that's, we love the diversity and the fact that we sort of have two legs in the, to stand on. But it's a constant issue with nonprofits. It's trying to kind of titrate between the two. And, donor funding is great in some sense because it's sort of high margin money in a funny way, but it's also hard to get and cultivate and so forth and so on. And grant funding and sort of pay for use funding is great, but that's much lower margin. I mean, the nonprofit world, honestly, as a business, is more complicated than people realize. Anyway, that's the answer to your question. Over here, I will scan. Yeah.
So you mentioned you collaborate a lot with other for-profit businesses. To what extent do you collaborate with governments?
Yeah, great question. So the question is, to what extent do we collaborate with governments? And the answer is, well, let's say a lot, but in a very particular way, and not the way we want to ultimately. Okay, what does that mean? That means that right now we get a fair amount of government funding from USAID, the US bilateral, and from DFID, which is the UK version of the bilateral, the UK bilateral. So if the question is, do we get government funding from those agencies? The answer is yes, we do. Ultimately, what we would like, of course, is to get local governments to pay for our service, right? To take some of their textbook budget and their education budget and direct it towards the digital world, because we can make the case. And in fact, there's some Stanford University students. Maybe some of you guys are here tonight. I'm not actually sure. But we had some Stanford Business School students that did a nice case study with us recently to help us understand our economics and how it compares to textbook budgets and so forth. We have not gone aggressively to host countries, to local governments, and asked them for funding yet, in part because we have a little bit of the sort of kind of internet mentality, which is first you get to a certain size and scale, and you come with a fair amount of data about what happens, and then you sort of monetize, and you ask them to pay. And these, I mean, I'll take the government of Ghana. I'm going to Ghana in a week. I mean, there's education budgets are always underfunded, and they're fraught with, they're complicated. So it takes a while to build a case that's strong enough so that you can go and ask an end user government for money. But the aid agencies and so forth tend to come in and they kind of bridge you a little bit, and that's kind of the mode we're in right now, is kind of a bridge mode. So, but it's a long game. I mean, another truth of the nonprofit world is because you're solving big social problems, often you have to think fairly long term about these things 5, 10, 15, 20 years, because there are a lot of institutions that you have to work with, and those institutions often have a certain pace that's, it just sort of is what it is. So we tend to try to think in that pace too and say, look, our first 5, 6 years, we're building proof points and we're building a strong case to make to local governments, and that will be something that we start to present to them, let's say, in sort of years 7, 8, 9, and 10. Yeah, that's kind of the way. Yeah.
I'm sorry if I missed it, but what age group are you targeting?
Yeah. No, you didn't miss it. I jumped quickly in the beginning. So the question is, what age group are we targeting? Again, we sort of have multiple programs that we've developed over the years. You saw the mobile reading to children, which targets very young children through their parents. That's a very new program for us. Our kind of bread and butter, let's say, our center of gravity is primary school children. Primary school children. So these are children who are learning to read, sort of typically 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade. Often they're switching from native mother tongue to English, although we have books in both. That's kind of our sort of center of gravity. But we have some programs, one program targeting even younger kids through the Mobile Reading to Children program, and we also do some work with older kids, primarily on cell phones. So long answer to a simple question, but that's kind of it. Yeah. Sure.
Can you talk about the logo? Because when I first
Sure.
read it, Worldreader, I would expect a book.
Uh-huh.
Something like that.
Yeah.
The second question is, can you download books from Worldreader?
Can you download books? Yeah, two great questions. So the logo, it's funny. We had a pro bono design agency come in years ago and help us design this. Depending on one way, you can look at it and you can see a child reading like this. That's one way to look at it. You can look at it, right, kind of like that. You can look at it another way and see a flower, and that's what a lot of people look at, and they sort of see a flower of knowledge. And we're sort of okay with either one. Whatever you see, we're sort of okay with your interpretation. Funnily enough, we've actually gotten some awards for our logo. I say funnily enough because it wasn't a huge focus of ours, but anyway, we've sort of grown to be in love with it. The second question, can you download books? You can. So And we have a terrible URL right now. Well, I mean, it's not terrible, but it's too long. If you type into your cell phone the word read, R-E-A-D, read.worldreader.org, so read.worldreader.org, into any web browser, that will bring up a web app version of our mobile app. And it's a great app, and I'd love your feedback on it. It's not, you will not see as many books here in the United States as you would see if you were in Ghana or Kenya or Uganda or Tanzania, because we have rights management software working in the background that limits the books you can see by geography to books that publishers are okay with our displaying in those geographies. But that's the system. We have an Android app that is just in its final stages of development, and that'll be our next app. So we have 4 different apps. But read.worldreader.org, I would love any feedback you have on it. And it's a very simple app, just allows you to read books and keep your place in a book and change the font size and basic stuff. But it works. It is all free. All the books you see there will be free. Yep. And maybe someday, back to your question, maybe someday we will have a portion of our digital library that people can pay for. It'll always be a small portion, but it'll be maybe a nice way to kind of add an additional revenue stream. But you have to get to a certain size before something like that matters. Other questions? Yeah.
Do you face any barriers where there are fewer educational, like where educational systems are not strong? Like, do you work in countries where that's an issue? Like, how do you deal with it?
We do. The question was, do we face barriers where education systems are not strong? I mean, absolutely. One of the meta discussions that you will bump into in the education space is sort of, do you work within the system, even though it may not always be as strong as you wanted, or do you sort of try to go, kind of around and direct to students? And there's this sort of constructivist idea of, kids working on their own, and maybe you've seen, these famous stories of, someone puts a laptop in a hole in the wall and, kids start to teach themselves to read and all sorts of things like this. The truth is, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that what can I say about that? Education tends to happen within the local educational context, which tends to look like a school with a teacher and books or no books, and a classroom or no classroom, but some construct like that. A lot of learning happens outside of that, but formal education, that system, it shows up around the world over and over again. And so we decided early on we wanted to work within that system and really reinforce that system. So every country we work in, we work with the local Minister of Education. Sometimes it's on a big scale, sometimes it's on a very pilot basis. And we recognize that some of the teachers are better trained and more capable and some are not. And we do a lot of teacher development and a lot of support and behind the scenes to make sure that they can make good use of the materials that we provide them. So the short answer is we see all kinds of systems, some impressive, some not so much. But we've taken the point of view right from the beginning that says we have to support the kind of teachers kind of wherever they are and sort of meet them halfway. We just think it's a more, it's not just that it's more scalable, it's a more sort of durable solution. We haven't yet seen, as I say, a lot of evidence of organizations that have sort of gone around and been around 5-10 years later. Last couple of questions, yeah. I'll come back to you because you asked one already. Yeah, you.
How are you guys differentiating yourself from, say, other websites that do free books online, Gutenberg, Internet Archive?
Yeah, great question. So the question was, how do we differentiate ourselves from other, book websites? So I would start by saying, again, I mean, the book website piece of it is only kind of a part of it. And I spent a lot of time talking about all the teacher support and other work we do, or the behavior change work we do, but that's just as important. Now, however, that said, the answer to your question more directly is, we have 31,000 books right now, which in a sense is a small number compared to the universe of books, but every one of those books has been handpicked, curated, 40 different local languages, all relevant to the kind of target market, quote unquote, and digitized and formatted at a very, very high level, and high quality level. Project Gutenberg, for example, or Internet Archive, they're sort of in the business of kind of mass, like vacuum up enormous amounts of public domain content often, But we're sort of at the other end of that in terms of we're much more focused on high quality and a highly curated list that's going to be relevant to people. And high quality digitization, and that sounds kind of funny, but I'll give you an example. One of the books we have is a book called Where There Is No Doctor. This is a sort of famous kind of backpacker's guide, kind of field guide to medicine. And we work very closely with that publisher, Hesperian Publishing, to make sure that when the diagrams and the words on the page are not physically separated on the page, because you run a real risk with health books that you read a diagram, you see a diagram, and you don't see the attached sort of descriptive language, and you can get yourself into real trouble there. So we spend a lot of time in sort of quality control mode, really trying to think, how do we make sure that the books we're reading are a high quality book that actually are exactly the type of book that are relevant to the people in our program. I'll give you one more example. It happens to be a health example too. One of the most popular fiction books in our program for young kids is a book called Kofi Has Malaria. This is a book by a Ghanaian publisher. It's about a kid who comes down with certain symptoms. He goes to the doctor, he gets a shot, and he goes home, and he's better. But this book is a book that's very relevant to kids in Ghana, and therefore it's very, very popular. That book you would never find in a public domain Project Gutenberg, sort of setting.
All right.
Aware of time, yeah, exactly right.
Please help me thank you, David.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.